been a massive good. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of absolute poverty and risen into the middle class. The level of development, human development that has occurred is wonderful. Objectively, it's cosmopolitan. We should all like that. It's on track to continue. The political system has opened up a little bit, because I believe in modernization theory, I don't worry about the very long-term future, because I think that over time, their development will either lead to social and political change that will mollify the system, moderate the system a little bit, or that if it doesn't, the progress will stop. Because you can't really run an advanced industrial society in the modern era from a top-down command approach and have a success. So for me, this is a practical policy challenge, is a sort of generational, long, careful dealing with an adolescent that avoids open conflict and nudges things along until they become a more responsible adult. As Bob Zellick said, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And so it's a practical challenge, but I don't think of it as a disaster. I don't think it's an inevitable war, and it's something people in security are aware of and trying to deal with.
Anybody else want to respond to that, or should we move on to the next question?
My name is Gil Kulik. I want to say that I think it was quite striking that it took an hour and 42 minutes before the subject of climate change came up. And I think that reflects a very worrisome sense of priority. Because I think, frankly, that everything else that has been discussed here will become irrelevant if the current trends continue and the global climate surpasses the 350 parts per million that have been defined as the sort of the limit of human civilization. And I'd just like to ask the whole panel to prognosticate on what the world will look like 10 years from now if the temperature is increased another degree and millions of people are climate refugees, that the oceans are rising, etc. You know all of the consequences. I'd like to have some of you just prognosticate on how that will affect the international order.
Or maybe you can prognosticate on whether you feel that the trajectory of growth of emissions is going to start curving downwards in a meaningful way.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of looking out over the next 10 years, I think if you are a small Pacific island state, I think there are some very sort of serious concerns in terms of rising sea level, and I don't think that the international system is at all prepared for it. I mean, when you look at international law around refugees, climate refugees have not yet been dealt with, and I think that that's something that we need to confront. So, I think there are different parts of the world that will, for example, in the next 10 years, could be severely impacted. I mean, I look at the Arctic. The Arctic is, it's in terms of climate change, it's twice as quickly as the rest of the world. So as a region, it's definitely something of concern in terms of the impact it's having in terms of rising sea level.
I'm a little less sanguine than you are about that. I don't think it's just the kind of drama that's going to transpire in the Pacific Islands or even just in the Arctic. I think we're already seeing consequences. Phil has been dying for us to bring Australia into the conversation. I think Australia just had a historical record heat wave, this high temperature year. And I hope technology will get us out of this, and I share Gideon's suspicion that there's not going to be some global movement where we all join arms and solve the problem multilaterally. But I don't think that's what I meant by complacency. I don't think that's a reason for us not to take a leadership position on this issue. I think it's the most important issue facing us.
If I can, I mean, I think that I don't share Gideon's optimism. I'm a bit shocked that someone can edit foreign affairs and be constantly dealing with all the world's crises and remain as extraordinarily optimistic as he seems to be. But I do think that's misplaced in relation to climate change. I think that it sure ain't the Pacific Islands that we need to worry about, although many of them are going to disappear. It's all of the climate regions. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, the impact is going to be absolutely dramatic. And linked to that, another issue that hasn't come up, and I feel a bit ashamed, of course, is the continuation of extreme poverty in the world. The fact that there continue to be 1 million people by the World Bank's conservative estimates and 2 billion by most experts' estimates, people who live in extreme poverty, whose position is not being touched at all by much of the progress that we are talking about. Indeed, the inequality persists in those areas as well, and their boat is not being lifted, and we're doing nothing about it. The reason I mention it here is that even the World Bank and others emphasize when it comes to climate change that the greatest impact is going to be on those 1 billion or 2 billion. We can get our way out of it technologically. They won't be able to. We need a fundamental change of attitude. And a country like Australia is a classic. Australia is now sort of officially a climate change denier. They have repealed carbon legislation, they are churning out the coal, and they are pretending that this is not an issue. That's not sustainable.
Phil, I published The Pessimist too, I just don't agree with you. On the climate change, I actually agree with Phil on this, which is that I think it's going to have a differential effect, and that rather than not affecting anybody or affecting everybody terribly, I think that you'll see a lot of adaptation in areas that are rich enough or dynamic enough or successful enough or creative enough to deal with it, and a lot of areas that are going to be struck very badly. And as usual, this change is going to screw the world's poor and disenfranchised and weak more than the rich who will find ways of dealing with it. With regard to the Arctic, it's actually a fascinating question, because you're not just seeing the Arctic's effect on the oceans. The Arctic itself is going to be this incredible new region of the world that is going to be open not just for business but for exploration and for trade. It's going to be the next 50 years. You're going to see places like Reykjavik and Anchorage being the Singapores and Taiwans and Hong Kongs of the next half century in a very interesting way.
And they'll be able to grow cotton there. Then go ahead, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Professor Hassan, when talking about what could be done to help the developing countries, he mentioned taxation. I was wondering whether that's one important issue for, developing countries. I mean, maybe countries that are at mid-level income, yes, but I'm thinking, why don't we talk about some old ideas that didn't work? One is, and we've talked a lot about technology. What about transfer of technology, which is an idea that came up in the 70s, but not much has been done. WIPO has, all kinds of schemes and so on, but it has not worked. And in the context of climate change, actually, that's something that could be used to help developing countries. And second old idea that could be used is the idea of changing the international regime for foreign direct investment. And we're seeing issues with Argentina now. I think that's one area where we could have rules that are more favorable to developing countries and that promote their development. And third old idea that's not been really pursued is, in general, changing the rules of international trade and make them more conducive to development. WTO has been working on this, but nothing came out of it. So I'd like to have your views on how those old ideas could be pushed.